Back on the SportsMax zone, the West Indies are gearing up for their two-test series against New Zealand, which starts Wednesday, 6 o'clock Eastern Caribbean time, 5 o'clock in Jamaica. The regional side has historically had difficulties in New Zealand, but just how badly have they struggled, and how do their results in New Zealand compare to their performances away to other test-playing nations? Ricardo Chambers takes a look.
When the first test starts Wednesday, it will mark the 12th time the Caribbean side is playing away to New Zealand in a test series. The Windies have won 3 of those, the first 2 in 1952 and 56, and then in 1995. But how does the West Indies record in New Zealand compare to playing away elsewhere? One way to assess is to look at win percentage. The highest win percentage away for the West Indies has not surprisingly come against the Minnows. In Bangladesh, the Windies have won 62.5% of matches. In Zimbabwe, where they have never lost, they have a 50% winning rate. Those are the only 2 teams where the win percentage is 50 or over. So where does New Zealand fall? 24.1%, meaning the West Indies have historically done better in New Zealand than they have done away to Pakistan, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. Note, they have never won a match in Sri Lanka and only one in South Africa. But also note, West Indies first toured Sri Lanka in 1993 and South Africa in 1998. Not exactly peak periods for Windies cricket. Let's now look at the percentage numbers for how often the Caribbean side has avoided defeat away from home. From a high of 100% against Zimbabwe to a low of 20% against South Africa. When assessed this way, the New Zealand numbers seem even better, where overall the Windies are avoiding defeat just over 58% of the times. The real problem is since 1995, which was the last time West Indies won a match and a series in New Zealand. Since then, they have played 12 matches, losing 8 and drawing 4, which is the trend against most recognized test-playing nations. The Windies have won 7 away series since that 95 New Zealand tour. All have come against Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, and most recently, Afghanistan. In terms of matches, with the exception of the Minnows, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, and Afghanistan, they have won just 9 away since that 95 New Zealand series. 5 of those have come against England, 2 against Australia in 1996, a shocking win against South Africa in 2007, and 1 against Pakistan in 2016. So, what are the conclusions here? 1. We love to play England.
Pleasant.
Both home and away. Maybe playing in New Zealand is not the real problem, but any and everywhere, the West Indies have been terrible since 1995. Then again, I guess we already knew that.
A lot to digest there from that Ricardo Chambers report. We're now joined by international cricket commentator Fazir Mohammed to look at the numbers and help us preview Wednesday's start of the first test, which will be played at Seddon Park in Hamilton. Faz, you've been covering West Indies cricket for decades, and Ricardo just illustrated in a very tangible manner the woes the West Indies have had on their away tours. New Zealand, obviously, not a place that they have been successful at. Only 3 series wins from 11 in New Zealand, who are not really considered, top flight test-playing nations, even though we could say that they are underestimated. Your thoughts on that, Rap, and what have you gleaned from it?
Well, I think, good evening, Lance, and good evening, everyone. I think he summed it up perfectly. Essentially, it tells the story, not just against New Zealand, but against anyone of substance in Test cricket, especially away from home. And when you talk about New Zealand, especially, Lance, I think you're right. They are continuously and consistently underrated, even after reaching the last 2 World Cup finals, 50-over finals, when they probably should have beaten England at least last year and were well beaten by Australia in the 2015 final. But when it comes to Test cricket, even in that great era of West Indies dominance, and if you want to put aside the 1980 series as an aberration because of the very poor umpiring and all of the controversies, Michael Holding kicking out a stump and the team almost abandoning the series in the midst of the second Test match, in 1987, in the midst of that period of dominance, the West Indies could only manage a 1-1 draw in New Zealand. So there is some validity in saying that, yes, the West Indies struggled generally away from home, even more so since 1995. But it's quite clear that after those early encouraging series wins in New Zealand, as was mentioned in the package, the West Indies, for whatever reason, and there are a number of factors, have found it extremely difficult to win in New Zealand.
Yeah, and coming from the 70s and 80s and part of the 90s of the West Indies dominance, very, very hard to digest that our away series in recent decades, Faz, have come against, minnows, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, and Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it tells the story, Lance. When we look at that overall message, and it's something some people say, well, you need to stop being so negative. You need to be more positive. We can only present the facts. And when you are basing your opinions or your assessments or your prognostications on facts and not what you hope. We all hope the West Indies can win the Test series. Will they? The evidence suggests that they won't. The evidence suggests that they'll struggle. The last time the West Indies would have gone to New Zealand and not lost a Test series was 2008 under the captaincy of Chris Gayle, and he scored a brilliant 191, I believe it was, to save the Test match in Napier, and the earlier one was affected seriously by rain. And in fact, the West Indies would have had about 4 drawn Test matches in a row over the last 10 years or so, and the majority of them would have been affected by rain. So the numbers, the form, the abilities of the respective teams consistently point in favor of New Zealand.
Faz, why is it so difficult away from home? You just spoke about the rain, of course, that would just mean we're unlucky. Or is it that those in charge are not putting systems in place to ensure that our Windies men are prepped when they go in a foreign place to play?
Well, we've had these struggles, Mariah, as we've mentioned many times over since 1995. Prior to that, we would win anyway. In fact, our last series win in 1995 would have been in New Zealand, ironically, winning by an innings and almost 300 runs. Courtney Walsh, the captain, taking 15 wickets in the match, and the West Indies looking so very dominant against a New Zealand team at the time that was in the midst of chaos. They were in administrative chaos. The team was unsettled. There were all sorts of issues within the team, and that was an exception. But prior to that, it was nothing unusual for the West Indies to win away from home. And we're not just talking about that dominant era. We're talking about going way back to 1950 and that famous series win in England in 1950. The West Indies went to New Zealand. 2 years later, won 1-0, went to New Zealand. 4 years after that, won 3-1. But after that, it's been really very scarce success, if any at all. But overall, to answer your question, Mariah, when we talk about 1995 to the present time, the West Indies, for a number of different reasons, just seem to have lost the plot as far as consistently being effective when it comes to Test cricket. We have those famous victories, Headingley, Port Elizabeth, Sharjah against Pakistan, but they're so few and far between that they're very easy to recollect because they hardly ever occur in the modern environment.
Okay, Faz, we hear you, but the West Indies head coach Phil Simmons is hoping that you are wrong. He is thinking that the West Indies batsmen can take the form they showed in the warm-up matches into the first Test.
I think it's been a good thing that we had to do 14 days in which we practiced, and then we had another a 3-day game and a 4-day game. So I think some of the young players who haven't been here have gotten a little accustomed to Test cricket conditions here, which I think is going to be similar from where we were to here. So I think they will offer a lot of mental strength, having gone through the period that we've gone through there, and we're going to push hard for them to put up the scores that they put up in the last 4-day game.
Okay, so Phil Simmons hoping that the batting clicks, of course, in the warm-up matches. We did see Craig Brathwaite getting a double 100. There was a century and a 93 from Darren Bravo, half centuries for Jermaine Blackwood and Shamar Brooks. So the batting doesn't look that bad, Faz. But the bowling really struggled, I think, in the last practice match, the 4-dayer. The West Indies used as many as 9 bowlers and still weren't able to get the New Zealand A team dismissed. Having said that, the West Indies have scored over 500 runs as well, so I guess it's reasonable to assume that the batting conditions were favourable.
And again, let's be clear about it. I'm hoping I'm wrong as well. I would be delighted to be talking in a couple of weeks' time, saying I was dead wrong as far as our expectations for the test match and that Phil Simmons was proven right in having faith in his players. But to answer your specific question about the batsmen getting runs and the struggles for the bowlers, they only got 4 wickets in the previous warm-up match, which was a 3-day fixture. And I wouldn't read too much necessarily into 9 bowlers being used because towards the end of a warm-up match, you're probably getting a bit relaxed. You don't want to have any of your key bowlers get injured. It's more of a workout to really work out any kinks, ensure that there are no niggles, no injuries. But it's fair to point out that if there's not a tremendous amount of success, it's going to be a concern from the bowling point of view. Can our bowlers take 20 wickets to win a test match in New Zealand, which is probably what you have to do unless they declare in either of their 2 innings. Conversely, the batsmen can only do what they are faced up against in the warm-up matches, and they generally did fairly well, of course. Brathwaite was outstanding in the second match. Bravo in both innings. A couple others got a few scores. But again, you have to balance that against the quality of the New Zealand A-team bowling as against the quality that we can expect from the New Zealand test team bowling. And yes, again, it will sound negative. It will sound as if you're harping on issues that may not materialize, but you can only base on what you've seen previously, that the West Indies have generally struggled against genuine, disciplined, seam and swing bowling, and maybe a bit of hostility as well from Wagner, and they're going to get a lot of that over those 2 test matches in New Zealand.
Yeah, so having said that then, Faz, we see that certainly since the start of their trip to New Zealand, batting has been favourable for not only the tourists, but the A team for New Zealand as well. What happens if the Windies win the toss tomorrow? What would you like to see happen for the West Indies, and how should they approach it tactically?
I suppose it depends a lot on what they see of the pitch, how green it is. Is there anything in it for the fast bowlers? Is it going to last? Will they consider playing Rakeem Cornwall to support Roston Chase or vice versa, depending on the conditions? I think a lot of it, Lance, really comes down to the surface. But if you're really talking about making a statement, and if it looks a pitch good for batting, you win the toss and you bat. You give the likes of Brathwaite and Campbell and Bravo opportunities to really get stuck in. They've got runs under their belts already. However, if it's overcast, if it's drizzly, because there has been some unsettled weather in New Zealand, we saw it affecting the T20 matches, you might want to think about bowling first. But again, at the end of the day, you could have all the plans that you want. It could very well be decided by either the pitch, the weather, or a combination of the 2.
All right, in 10 seconds, Faz, should Hetmeyer play?
I think he should, because I think he has that ability, and they're showing that faith in him. I would give him another opportunity, yes.
Thanks, Faz. 6 o'clock Eastern Caribbean time, 5 o'clock in Jamaica. That's the time for the first ball in this first test match against New Zealand for the West Indies cricketers. Brent Sancho, you are a footballer, not a cricketer, but the concept of having to perform in an overseas assignment, can you talk to us briefly about that as an international for TNT, going overseas to play, in Mexico or the USA? How difficult is that as against the comfort of your home environment?
It's extremely difficult. First of all, you talk about going into an environment where you're not used to, things that you're not accustomed to, the food, the different time zones when you switch time zones, etc. It is a challenge. It's amazing, of course. I think from a West Indies perspective, however, they would have experienced the bubble situation in England, and we have to talk about pandemic because it is a factor, and they would have experienced that in England. And I think because of that, they should have come out a bit better. Of course, they've been there a month so far, closing in a month, and I think that as well will help as it relates to their preparation. But at the end of the day, when you look back at from 1995 to now, and how horrible we've performed, it's so difficult to suggest anything else but probably not going in the West Indies way.
Okay, so Brent Sancho on point with his comments there. Let's hope his Trinidadian friends like Shannon Gabriel and Darren Bravo will be on point in the coming days in New Zealand. There is a lot of cricket on the home of champions. One-day international cricket continuing tonight. Australia 2-0 up against India and going for a clean sweep. The action starts at 10:40 Jamaica time, 11:40 Eastern Caribbean time.